Hey, welcome to Agnes Thompson's channel. My name's Eleanor, and I'm going to share my story with you.
My old house in Oregon smells of dried herbs, beeswax, and memories. At 75, I've learned to cherish these scents more than the most expensive perfumes Susan sometimes gives me for Christmas, bottles that remain untouched on my dresser. The walls of this house, built by my grandfather from local cedar, are soaked in stories that the modern world has long forgotten how to hear. Every ceiling beam, darkened with age, remembers harsh winters and the laughter of children running through the house. Every window, with its wavy, imperfect glass, has watched generations of Vances come and go. My pension, modest like that of most Americans my age, forces me to plan every trip to the store meticulously and keep a close eye on the electricity bills. But this house and the 6 acres of wild forest surrounding it are my true, untaxable wealth. Here, far from the city's hustle, I feel not just like Eleanor Vance, a woman whose existence is defined for the government by her social security number and Medicare card, but a part of something eternal and unshakable. My life flows at a measured pace, in rhythm with nature. In the morning, when the first rays of sun cut through the fog that blankets the valley, I go out to my garden. I check on my tomatoes, which, I swear, grow juicier and redder from my conversations than from any organic fertilizer. I pull the weeds not with annoyance, but with gratitude, setting aside the chickweed and lamb's quarters. They make an excellent addition to a salad. In the afternoon, when the sun is high, I walk into the woods. To others, it's just trees and bushes, a frightening unknown full of ticks and wild animals. For me, it's a living pharmacy and a pantry. My grandmother Amelia taught me this art when I was just a girl. I still remember her. I remember how she would take my small hand in hers, calloused from the earth, but surprisingly gentle, and lead me along paths that only she knew. Nature is a generous mother, Ellie, she would say in her low, calm voice, but only to those who know how to ask with respect and take with gratitude. Never take everything. Leave half for the forest, so it can feed its own children and grow back. She taught me to distinguish an edible burdock root from a poisonous hemlock, pointing to the telltale purple splotches on the latter's stem. She taught me how to brew vitamin C-rich tea from pine needles, which saved us from colds during the long winters, and how to use the sticky web of a plantain leaf to stop the bleeding from a scraped knee. This knowledge, woven into my DNA, felt like a priceless inheritance, a secret language I could speak with the world. But to my family, it was nothing more than a quaint eccentricity. My son, David, his wife, Susan, and their children, 15-year-old Jake and 12-year-old Chloe, lived in a different world. A world of glass and concrete, where food is ordered through an app and illnesses are treated with pills whose names are impossible to pronounce. David, a successful manager at an IT company, was always proud of providing his family with the very best. By the best, he meant the latest smartphones, a smart home that spoke to them in the voice of an indifferent woman, and vacations at 5-star hotels where they never ventured off the property. I loved them with all my heart, but their every visit was a collision of 2 galaxies, one of which was slowly fading. That weekend, they came for my 75th birthday. As always, David brought a mountain of groceries from Whole Foods, organic kale, gluten-free bread, coconut water in designer bottles. As he unloaded the bags onto my old oak kitchen counter, it felt like the bright, screaming packaging was looking down on my humble jars of homemade pickles and wild blackberry jam. "Mom, we decided to give you a surprise," David announced, beaming with the smile he used in business meetings. "We've rented a luxury cabin in the mountains for a week by Crystal Lake. No cooking, no chores. Just fresh air, a fireplace, and full service." Susan, an elegant woman who looked like she'd just stepped out of a fashion magazine, added, adjusting her perfect hair, "It has amazing Wi-Fi, so the kids won't get bored and can do their homework online. And a spa. You deserve a real break, Eleanor. Enough messing around in the dirt." My heart sank. They didn't understand. For me, a break wasn't a spa with its smell of chlorine and eucalyptus oil. It was the silence of the forest, the song of the birds, the satisfaction of being able to feed myself with the gifts of the land that I had found and prepared myself. But I didn't want to offend them. At my age, you learn to value peace in the family over being right. I forced a smile and thanked them, hiding a deep sigh. The next day, we drove to the mountains in their huge SUV, which purred like a well-fed beast. The cabin was indeed magnificent. Panoramic windows with a view of the lake, modern Scandinavian-style furniture, a kitchen gleaming with chrome and steel, where even the trash can had a motion sensor. Jake and Chloe immediately connected to the Wi-Fi and disappeared into their rooms, immersing themselves in virtual worlds where they fought dragons and built cities. David and Susan opened a bottle of expensive wine and settled on the terrace, discussing David's quarterly report and an upcoming merger. I felt like a stranger at this celebration of life. I was drawn outside, to the forest that began right behind the house. I put on my old hiking boots and went for a walk. The air was crisp and cool. So many familiar things grew all around: wild sorrel, nettles, young fiddlehead ferns. I mentally noted, this is for soup, this for a salad, and you can make flour from this root. I gathered a small bunch of young nettles, carefully picking only the top, most tender leaves. When I returned, Susan and the kids were on the terrace. Chloe was complaining that the internet was lagging, and she couldn't load a new video from her favorite influencer. "Grandma, what's in your hand?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "Is it spiky?" I showed her the bunch. "This is stinging nettle. If you cook it right, it makes a delicious and very healthy soup. It has more iron than the spinach your dad brought." Jake looked up from his phone and snorted. "Seriously? Eating weeds? Grandma, this isn't the Middle Ages. Dad bought like 6 kinds of organic lettuce in a sealed bag yesterday." Susan laughed softly. That laugh hurt more than any slap. It wasn't mean, no. It was condescending. The laugh of an adult listening to a child's naive fantasies. "Oh, Eleanor, it's so sweet that you remember all those old recipes," she said, sipping her wine. "But really, why complicate things? We have a fridge full of food. David, honey, should we order a pizza? I saw a place that delivers up here, an artisanal pizzeria. They have a gluten-free crust." In that moment, I felt not just old, but like a fossil. A relic from another era, whose knowledge and skills had turned to dust. A funny anecdote for modern, successful people. I tried to explain that it wasn't just food, it was independence, a connection with nature, the ability to survive if suddenly. If suddenly what? David interrupted, smiling his signature ill-handle-it smile. "A zombie apocalypse? Mom, relax. We're in the 21st century. Every problem can be solved with a phone call or a click of a mouse. I have platinum status with customer support. They'll solve any problem in an hour." They laughed. All of them. Even Chloe, my sweet little Chloe, giggled, looking at her mother. They laughed at my nettles, at my knowledge, at my entire life. I silently walked over to the gleaming chrome trash can. It opened before me with a quiet whir, and I dropped the nettles inside. The green leaves landed on the packaging from a bag of organic chips. I felt something inside me break. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the bitter realization of the chasm that lay between me and the people I held most dear. I went to my room, claiming I was tired. Outside, dusk was gathering, painting the lake in leaden tones. I watched the still surface of the water and felt tears stream down my cheeks. Not tears of resentment, but of helplessness. How could I pass on what couldn't be bought? How could I explain that the most important things in life don't have a price tag and aren't delivered by a courier? I thought of my grandmother Amelia. What would she say? She'd probably just shake her head and go about her business, knowing that words are useless until life itself teaches the lesson. It was at that exact moment that the earth shook. First came a low, guttural roar that seemed to rise from the very heart of the planet. It grew with terrifying speed, turning into a roar. The walls of the house began to tremble so violently they seemed about to collapse. Books and decorative vases flew off the shelves. I heard the frightened screams of Susan and the children from the living room, drowned out by the sound of shattering glass. The floor gave way beneath my feet. I clung to the doorframe, trying to stay upright. The world turned into a chaos of rumbling, cracking, and a raw, animalistic fear. It lasted for maybe a minute, or maybe an eternity. And then, everything went silent. An absolute, deafening silence fell. Even the birds were quiet. All the lights went out. The house was plunged into darkness, broken only by the pale light of the moon filtering through the panoramic windows. I cautiously made my way to the living room. David, Susan, and the children were huddled together in the middle of the room, among shards of glass and overturned furniture. Their faces were white with terror in the moonlight. "What? What was that?" Susan whispered, her voice trembling. "An earthquake," David answered hoarsely. He was frantically tapping at the screen of his phone. "Damn it, no service. Nothing. Not a single bar. No Wi-Fi, no cellular." He rushed to the landline on the wall, a sleek, designer phone. There was no dial tone. He flicked a light switch. "Nothing. The power's out," he stated, and for the first time in years, I heard confusion in his voice. "The backup generators should kick in. They run on diesel." We waited. But the generators didn't kick in. The silence grew more ominous. We were cut off. In a luxurious, modern cabin full of useless technology. Dozens of miles from the nearest town, with a road that was most likely destroyed. David looked at me. The condescending smile was gone from his eyes. There was only fear. The naked, primal fear of a man who realized his credit card and platinum customer support status meant nothing anymore. And I looked out the window at the dark, silent forest. And I knew that there, in its deep shadows, everything was the same as it had always been. Edible roots and healing herbs still grew there. The answers were there. But I said nothing. Not yet. I looked at my family, at these frightened, helpless people, and I waited. I didn't know what lay ahead, what trials fate had in store for us. I only knew one thing: their world, built on technology and money, had just collapsed. And now, perhaps, they would have to learn to live in mine. The first night was the worst. Not because of the lack of light or the cold that seemed to seep right through the glass walls of the expensive cabin. It was the silence. A silence unbroken by the hum of the refrigerator, the ping of smartphone notifications, or the background noise of a television was deafening. It was alive, oppressive, filled with the unknown and the creaks of the house settling after the shock. We sat in the living room, illuminated only by the dim flame of a few vanilla-scented decorative candles Susan had found in a drawer. Their cloyingly sweet scent seemed inappropriate, almost sacrilegious, in this atmosphere of primal fear. David tried to keep his composure, but he was failing. He paced the room as if conducting an important meeting in his office, giving out instructions that had lost all meaning in our new reality. "Okay, in the morning, I'll try to reach the main road. Maybe there are rescue teams there already. Susan, check the food supplies. Make a list. Kids, stay quiet and don't panic. Conserve your phone batteries. Use them only as flashlights." But his voice trembled and his hands kept reaching for the useless piece of plastic and metal that was his phone. He was like the captain of a sinking ship, trying to give orders over a radio that was already deep underwater. Susan, pale and bewildered, took inventory of the refrigerator and pantry by the light of her iPhone. Organic yogurt, a few avocados, kale chips, almond milk. She muttered, her voice breaking. "It's all going to spoil without electricity. The only non-perishables we have are a box of crackers and 2 granola bars. And a bottle of maple syrup." Her world of perfect products and balanced diets was crumbling before her eyes. She looked at the food not as a source of energy, but as a symbol of a fallen civilization. The children, Jake and Chloe, sat huddled together on the huge designer sofa. Their usual teenage aloofness had vanished, replaced by a childlike terror. In their eyes, I saw a reflection of my own fear, but my fear was different. I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid for them, for these delicate, greenhouse-raised creatures who knew how to do nothing but consume. I, on the other hand, sat in my armchair all night, listening. I listened to the house as it settled and groaned after the shock. I listened to the forest, which lived its usual, unperturbed life. I could feel the earth breathing beneath us, and its breath calmed me. I knew we wouldn't die. At least, not from hunger. But I also knew that the lesson they were about to learn would be a brutal one. Morning brought no relief. David, as promised, went out to reconnoiter. Susan tried to talk him out of it, but he was adamant, desperate to reclaim his role as protector. He returned 3 hours later, dirty, exhausted, and defeated. His expensive hiking jacket was torn, and a deep scratch ran across his face. "The road is gone," he exhaled, collapsing onto the sofa. "Just gone. A massive landslide. There's a wall of rocks and trees as high as this house. I try to find a way around, but it's a sheer drop. We're trapped." That word, trapped, hung in the air. Panic, which had been smoldering under the ashes of hope, flared up with new intensity. Susan began to cry, covering her face with her hands. Chloe clung to her. Even Jake, the eternal cynic, looked terrified. "So what now?" His voice cracked. "Are we going to die here?" David didn't answer. He just stared into space. All his confidence, all his managerial bravado, had evaporated. He was a broken man. And that's when I stood up. My old bones ached, but I straightened my back. All eyes turned to me. In the ensuing silence, my footsteps on the creaky floor sounded deafeningly loud. "We are not going to die," I said, my voice calm and firm. "At least, not today. David, you need water. Not from the tap. We don't know what's happened to the pipes after the quake. We need clean water. Jake, you're coming with me. We need fire." David looked at me with bewilderment. "What fire, Mom? What are we going to light it with?" "There are no lighters, no matches." "With what the forest gives us," I replied. I led Jake outside. He followed me reluctantly, stumbling and grumbling that this is all pointless. I ignored his whining. I showed him how to gather dry twigs, how to find birch bark that burns even when damp, how to find pine resin, a natural fuel. "Look," I said, "don't take it from the ground, it's damp there. Break off the lower dead branches from the pine trees." He watched me with disbelief, but he obeyed. In his eyes, I saw a mixture of contempt and curiosity. When we returned, we found David and Susan trying in vain to open the automatic blinds on the windows. "They're electric," David said in despair. "We're like sardines in a can." Without a word, I picked up a heavy, wrought iron candlestick and walked decisively toward one of the huge panoramic windows. "Mom, no!" David shouted. I swung. Shards of glass rained down onto the floor. Susan screamed. "Mom, what are you doing?" "That's an argon-filled window pane. It costs $10,000. "It costs zero now, David," I retorted. "But fresh air and light are priceless. And this is now our way out." I cleared a space by the fireplace, which was decorative, with fake logs and an LED light. We hauled the useless contraption out and built a hearth from stones I'd brought from outside. Using a flint from my old hiking kit, which I always carried in my jacket pocket, and some dry tinder, I struck a spark. Jake, who was watching me, leaned forward involuntarily. When the spark caught the moss and then the birch bark, something like wonder flashed in his eyes. Soon, a fire was crackling merrily in our makeshift hearth. It was the first glimmer of hope. The next step was food. The supplies from the refrigerator were dwindling fast. On the third day, I took Chloe to the lake. "Look," I said, pointing to the plants growing by the shore. "Those are cattails. You can bake the roots. They're like potatoes. And you can eat the young shoots raw." Chloe stared at me wide-eyed. "Really?" I dug up a few fleshy roots with my old knife. We brought them back and baked them in the coals. They tasted starchy, a little sweet. It wasn't pizza or a burger, but it was food. Hot, filling food. Susan ate in silence, not looking me in the eye. David chewed slowly, thoughtfully. The days blurred into one long, grueling marathon of survival. I taught them. I showed them how to make snares for small game from a fishing line I found in an old tackle box. For the first few days, the snares were empty, and Jake was losing hope, but on the fourth day, a rabbit was caught in one. Jake stared at it with a mixture of pride and horror. I had to show him how to properly dress the animal, explaining that you must respect the creature that gave its life so that we could live. It was a brutal but necessary lesson. I taught them how to purify water by passing it through a homemade filter of sand, charcoal from our fire, and cloth torn from a pillowcase. I showed them edible dandelion leaves and burdock root. We cooked a nourishing broth from the rabbit bones and food scraps they used to throw away without a second thought. They were changing. Slowly, reluctantly, but they were changing. Susan, who used to be afraid of chipping her manicure, now cleaned the roots we dug up without a hint of squeamishness. Jake learned to distinguish animal tracks and became my chief wood-gatherer. Chloe turned out to be the most gifted student. She absorbed my every word with delight, memorized the names of plants, and proudly brought back her bounty, a bunch of wild onions or a handful of forest berries that I had pre-approved. But David resisted the longest. He was an engineer, a man of logic and systems. This primitive world was alien to him. He tried to create a duty roster, draw a map of the area, calculate our chances of survival in percentages. One day, he spent half the afternoon trying to fix the generator, taking it apart piece by piece, while I silently watched his futile efforts. "It's useless," he finally said, wiping his dirty hands on his expensive pants. "Without parts and tools, I can't do anything." "Sometimes the best tools are your own hands and head, son," I said quietly. "And knowledge." He gave me a long, hard look. That evening, for the first time, he asked me to teach him how to properly sharpen a knife with a stone. The tension, however, did not subside. We were constantly hungry. Our meager findings were barely enough to keep us going. The stress led to arguments. One day, Susan yelled at David, blaming him for bringing them to this hole. Jake snapped at his father, seeing his helplessness. I had to be not only a provider but also a diplomat, reminding them that we would only survive if we stayed together. At the end of the second week, David, having lost his patience and wanting to prove he could still be in charge, went into the woods alone, against my warnings. He was sure he could find something substantial. He returned a few hours later, triumphant. In his hands was a handful of beautiful, glossy red berries. "Look," he announced proudly. "I found them. A whole patch. We're saved." Susan and the children looked at the berries with hope. Chloe was already reaching out her hand. I looked at the berries, and my heart plummeted. I recognized them. Smooth, seductive, they grew on a low bush with dark leaves. "Don't touch them," I shouted so sharply that everyone jumped. "David, throw them away." "What's wrong now, Mom?" he asked, irritated. "They're just berries. They look like cranberries or lingonberries." "I know, I've seen pictures on the internet." I walked over and took one of the berries. "Look, David. Cranberries have 4 petals on their flower and grow on a trailing vine. These are wolfberries, one of the most poisonous in this forest." He scoffed, but a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. "You're exaggerating. They're just wild berries." And to prove his point, he popped several into his mouth. "No," I screamed, but it was too late. He chewed and swallowed, looking at me defiantly. And then his face changed. Confidence gave way to confusion, then to fear. "There, bitter," he choked out and turned pale. He immediately tried to make himself vomit, but I knew the poison had already begun to work. An hour later, he was writhing from terrible stomach pains. He was vomiting, convulsing on the floor, and I could see the life draining out of him. Susan was sobbing beside him, the children cowering in a corner in terror. All their newly acquired skills were useless in the face of this disaster. Their modern first aid kit, full of painkillers and antiseptics, was powerless. Panic seized them again. They looked at me with desperation and a final, ghostly hope. I stood up, my face as hard as stone. I knew there was almost no time. The poison was acting fast. Hundreds of images flashed through my mind: herbs, roots, bark. My grandmother's lessons, which had seemed so ridiculous and outdated to them. I looked at my son, groaning in pain, and at his terrified family. At that moment, I was their only chance. My forgotten skills were their only hope for survival. But what I did next shattered all their expectations. You won't believe how it ended. The moment I looked at my son writhing in pain, the world narrowed to a single purpose. There was no time for panic, for persuasion, for explanations. There was only the poison flowing through his veins and my knowledge, which had to stop it. The fear I saw in the eyes of Susan and my grandchildren became my fuel, making me forget my own aching joints and fatigue. "Jake." My voice was sharp, like the crack of a whip, and it jolted him from his stupor. "Quick, get me the biggest pot and fill it with water from the lake. Don't stop, run. Chloe, get the fire blazing hot, add the driest wood. Susan, don't let him lose consciousness. Talk to him, rub his hands, do anything." They scrambled to follow my commands without a single question. Their blind, desperate obedience was more eloquent than any words. I grabbed my knife, a small woven basket, and ran out of the house, through the shattered window. I didn't run, I flew through the forest, which was now not just a source of food, but an emergency room pharmacy. My mind worked with incredible speed, sifting through options. I needed an absorbent to bind the poison and something to induce a powerful purge. I knew what I had to do. My feet carried me on their own along familiar paths, and my grandmother Amelia's calm voice echoed in my head, as if she were walking beside me. First, I rushed to an old, charred stump, the remains of a fire from many years ago. I chipped off several large pieces of wood charcoal with my knife. "The best purifier, Ellie," I remembered her saying. "It will soak up any sickness." Then I ran on, towards a marshy hollow by a stream, where the earth was damp and smelled of decay. My eyes searched for it, a tall stalk with purple flowers and large, burdock-like leaves. There it was. Valerian root. In small doses, it's a calming agent, but in large doses, it's a powerful emetic and laxative. It was risky but necessary. I dug up several fleshy roots, shaking the dirt from them. When I returned to the cabin, I saw that Jake had already brought the water and Chloe was maintaining a roaring fire, her face focused and serious. David was getting worse, his breathing shallow. "Quickly," I commanded. I threw the charcoal directly into the fire to heat it and purify it. Then, using 2 flat stones as a mortar and pestle, I crushed it into a fine black powder. I finally chopped the valerian root. "Susan, hold him." I mixed the charcoal powder with water into a thick black slurry. Pinching David's nose, I poured the mixture into his mouth. He coughed, trying to spit it out, but I was relentless. "Swallow, David. Swallow if you want to live." He managed to get it down. A few minutes later, I brewed the valerian root in boiling water and forced him to drink the bitter concoction as well. What followed was difficult and unpleasant. David's body began to violently purge the poison. I didn't leave his side for a moment, supporting him, wiping the cold sweat from his brow. Susan, Jake, and Chloe silently helped me, passing water and clean cloths. In that grim, primitive scene, there was no room for squeamishness or shame. There was only the fight for a life. It went on for hours. Finally, exhausted and pale as a sheet, David fell into a restless sleep. I sat beside him, listening to his breathing. It was steadier. The fever was breaking. I knew the crisis had passed. He would live. I looked up and met Susan's gaze. Her face, tear-stained and exhausted, held something more than gratitude. It was awe, a realization. She was looking at me as if for the first time. Not as a sweet old lady with her funny herbs, but as the keeper of an ancient, powerful force. How do you know all this?" she whispered. "My grandmother taught me," I answered quietly. "And her grandmother taught her. It's what we've passed down from generation to generation. The thing you all laughed at." I said it without reproach, simply stating a fact. Susan lowered her eyes, and I saw a tear of shame roll down her cheek. From that day on, everything changed. It wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a tectonic shift in their consciousness. They were no longer my reluctant students. They were my followers. David, once he recovered, was quiet and contemplative. He followed me through the woods like a shadow, absorbing every word. He learned to read tracks, to find north by the moss on the trees, to understand the language of the forest. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, reverent respect. Susan found a notebook and pencil, intended for guest comments, in the cabin and began to keep a journal. She sketched the plants I showed her, writing down their properties and uses. Her elegant handwriting formed the names. Plantain stops bleeding. Willow bark reduces fever. yarrow for stomach pain. She was creating a new encyclopedia, her own, based not on data from the internet, but on real, hard-won experience. Jake and Chloe blossomed. Deprived of their gadgets, they discovered the real world. Jake turned out to be a natural tracker and hunter. He learned to set snares so skillfully that we had fresh game almost every day. And Chloe became my little herbalist. She knew where to find mint for a calming tea and sorrel for soup. She no longer complained of being bored. Her eyes shone with curiosity and the thrill of discovery. We established a routine. We smoked meat, dried mushrooms and berries, and built up our stores. We became a single organism, a family in the truest sense of the word. We talked by the fire in the evenings, sharing stories and plans. We laughed. But it was a different kind of laughter now, warm, genuine, coming from the heart. Nearly 3 weeks had passed when we first heard it, the distant hum of a helicopter. It flew high above us and disappeared behind a mountain. Rescue was close. But to my surprise, no one rushed to scream and wave. We looked at each other, and there was no jubilation in our eyes. There was only a quiet sadness that our small, difficult, but real world would soon end. And then came the final, most important lesson. The day before the rescuers found us, I decided to check the stream we'd been getting our water from, walking further upstream. David came with me. About a mile from our camp, we saw the source of a problem we never knew we had. A smaller landslide, caused by the earthquake, had exposed a layer of rock with yellowish, oily veins. I recognized the sinister gleam immediately. It was arsenic-rich rock. The stream was slowly but surely poisoning the water. David stared at it in horror. But we boiled the water. Boiling kills germs, son, I said softly. But it doesn't remove heavy metals and poisons. They would have accumulated in our bodies. Slowly. We wouldn't have felt a thing until it was too late. He turned pale. But why aren't we sick? Because from the very first day, I've been adding a bunch of sphagnum moss to our drinking water pot. My grandmother said it cleans the water of evil spirits. I never knew how it worked. I just trusted her. That moss, David, is the best natural filter. It was absorbing the poison, drop by drop. Every single day. David stared silently, first at the ominous yellow rocks, then at me. And I saw in his eyes not just respect. I saw reverence. He understood. He finally understood everything. My old wives' tales, my outdated methods, hadn't just saved his life from the berries. They had been saving all of them, every day, from a slow and agonizing death they never even knew they were facing. My eccentricity, the very thing they had laughed at, had been their invisible shield. When the rescuers finally reached us, they were stunned. They had expected to find exhausted, starving, broken people. Instead, they found a cohesive, organized group with a stock of food, clean water, and a functioning camp. Returning to civilization was a shock. The noise, the rush, the meaningless conversations, it all felt alien and false. My family was changed forever. David quit his high-paying job and, investing a portion of his savings, opened a small survival school for city dwellers. He called it Vance Trails. Susan started writing a book, not about fashion, but about medicinal herbs and the power of nature. She titled it The Whisper of Forgotten Paths. Jake and Chloe visit me at my old house every weekend, and we walk in the woods together. Not for survival, but for life. Sometimes, in the evenings, sitting by the fire in my old house, we remember those weeks in the mountains. And we no longer laugh at my stinging nettles. Because now we know, hidden in that simple weed is not just food. It's life itself. It's the wisdom of generations, something you can't download from the internet. It's a legacy that no amount of money can buy. And I, Eleanor Vance, at 75 years old, had finally been able to pass it on. My life had found its purpose. My legacy had grown through the ashes of their old world to give birth to a new one. And it will live on.